Hey everybody, welcome to More, week 2, and this special edition of More during this month of July, where each of our location pastors are preaching their own series or individual messages. We here during these weeks, whether you're doing this as a group or as an individual, are focusing on the importance of worship. Really digging into worship and the many facets of worship and why it's so vital to us in our discipleship process as followers of Christ. Last week, we opened that series talking about some of those big ideas. Today, I want to dig a little bit deeper. There's one man that really has been kind of attributed with the work and interests related to worship itself here in modern times. His name was A.W. Tozer. He was the first man in modern times to publish a book on the topic of worship. It was entitled Worship. And in that book, he really gave us an opportunity to get a glimpse into not only how we were created, but specifically how we were created to worship, and really why that matters and why that's important. I would encourage you to maybe look that book up if you're a reader and spend some time there. It's a great book. And so let me just say this. Let me just read a little bit of a quote from that book, Worship. This is what A.W. Tozer had to say about this. He starts by saying, man was made to worship God. I think that's so important for us. Man was made to worship God. When we were created in His image, He made us to worship. He goes on to say this in the book. He said, worship is the missing jewel in modern evangelicalism. We're organized, we work, we have our agendas, we have almost everything, but there's one thing that the churches, even the gospel churches, do not have. That is the ability to worship. We're not cultivating the art of worship. It's the one shining gem that is lost to the modern church. And I believe we ought to search for this until we find it. I think that's an incredibly insightful look at this missing jewel, the idea of our created purpose being fulfilled, and that is to worship God. I do think that there are moments in our churches where the element of worship is at least explored or touched on. We certainly do that across our locations with music and preaching and various things. But I often wonder if when we are in the midst of those moments, if we individually really are worshiping, or if we are guilty of being more of a spectator. And so what I wanted to do today is this. I want to spend just a few minutes offering you 4 things that worship is, that worship should be. Because God doesn't leave us in the dark concerning worship. He created us to worship, we're commanded to worship, and He tells us how we should worship. So in your notes, you'll find these 4 things listed. And I'm going to mention a few scriptures along the way here in the video, but I'll add probably a few more for you to explore, again, as individuals or groups, and your time in More this week. The first thing that true worship is, it is a response of obedience to God. It's a response of obedience to God. I would say it like this. If you are a follower, if you're a child of God, worship is not optional. It is not optional. It's not something we can choose to do or not to do based on our personal preferences or based on our personal circumstances in life. This is how David said it in Psalm 29, verse 2. He said, ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of His holiness. That is very specific, isn't it? He doesn't leave any room for us to speculate or look at and decide, do we want to worship or do we not want to worship? If worship is an act of obedience, David tells us very clearly that worship is not optional. Worship the Lord. And then in verse 95, the psalmist would go on to say this in verse 2, let us enter His presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout triumphantly to Him in song. And then and down in verse 6, one of my favorite verses in all the Psalms, we're commanded, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. What a powerful thought that is. Again, I'll share those verses with you and allow you an opportunity maybe to explore a few other verses in that as well. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is a chapter we've looked at so often, where God really lays out to his people how we are to relate to him. As his creation, we are to love him with all of our heart, soul, and minds. We even touched on that last week as well. He is to be praised. He is to be blessed, gloried in, feared, exalted, extolled, thanked, rejoiced in, all of those things. I think that the first priority we cannot ignore is that if we come together, a response, our first response in true worship is obedience to God in our worship. When we are not obedient in this, I think we're going to fail to receive everything God has for us. The second thing true worship is it shows reverent submission to God. The root of the Hebrew word for worship means to bow down. Psalm 95 verse 6, come let us worship and bow down. Bowing is an outward sign of worship. When we worship God, I think it's the moment where we can recognize and even celebrate who he is. Revelation chapter 4, and I won't read this whole passage, but I encourage you, I'll put it in the notes, I encourage you to spend some time in Revelation 4, specifically in verses 10 and 11, because in those two verses, we really get a glimpse of that reverent worship before a holy God. This is what it says. It says, the 24 elders fell down before the one seated on the throne and worshiped the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne and say, our Lord and God, you are worthy to receive glory and honor and power, because you have created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. And so in this great worship service, we find them bowing down. That's worship, giving back to God that which he deserves, reverently, humbly submitting to him. Number 3, true worship is the result of the death of Christ. I think this is just maybe simple in its statement, but I wanted to add this to our notes today. We worship today because we are redeemed through the blood of Christ. When he died on the cross, he tore the veil from the top to the bottom, separating the Holy of Holies, radically changing worship. We no longer have someone we have to go between. We can go directly before the throne of God. We can come now to him and worship him. And then number 4, I think true worship is a reflection of our whole life. It's not just a Sunday morning thing. It's not just when we get in a tight spot, or from our last series, a stuck situation, that we turn to worship. Worship should be something that is the response of our heart, that is the revealing of our passion and our excitement and our joy to serve and worship him. And I wonder at times if that really describes us. What you do in worship is a microcosm of all that you are and all that you do beyond that one moment. Romans chapter 12 verse 1 says, present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. It's not something that we compartmentalize. It's not something that we segregate into those moments where we're around other Christians in a worship service. It really is to be the totality of our life and everything I do. So maybe succinctly say it like this: everything I do, everything I say, everywhere I go, everything I think is an outgrowth of my love for God and an expression of my worship to him. So that our worship, our lives have this one central focus: honoring and glorifying God. We'll spend some time in those texts that will follow in your notes, and we'll see you back here for week 3 in this little mini series of more as we look at the importance of worship. We'll see you next week. God bless.